Okay, hello, and thanks for coming to this panel about the Latin American independent media. I'm Clara Gonzalez. I'm from the NGO People in Need, a Czech NGO where we work with independent journalists in Latin America. And here there are two independent journalists we collaborate with. One is Danae Vílchez from Nicaragua and Ignacio Gonzalez from Cuba. So I will let them introduce themselves for the beginning. Danae?
My name is Danae. I work in Confidencial.ni and the TV show Esta Semana. Well, we are one of the few independent media in Nicaragua, and basically we do a lot of stuff. We are a small team that does both things. Confidencial en Esta Semana, directed by the same person, Carlos Fernando Chamorro, and we cover human rights issues. We do investigations, social issues, and academic as well. Don't know what to say more.
Hello everyone, my name is Ignacio Gonzalez. I came from Cuba, from an independent media. I publish on YouTube a channel called Caliente, Prensa, Libre. We're kind of changing the way independent journalism in Cuba is working. We also publish different kind of works in different fields like cultural fields, social fields, and politic fields in order to change the way independent journalism in the island is seen by the rest of the people, national and both international people.
Okay, so I think it's important to signal that even if the freedom of press situation is different in Cuba and in Nicaragua, because in Nicaragua the newspaper Dana is working is recognized by the government, and in Cuba is not the case. All the independent media are undercover. But in both countries, the restrictions to freedom of speech make the work of the journalist quite difficult. So I would like them to explain to start how they see the journalism situation in their countries.
Okay, to explain what happens in Nicaragua, we have to talk about what is happening regarding the freedom of expression. So first of all, you have to know that the current government that began in 2006 with Daniel Ortega's election, that was fully reported as fraudulent. It was a very criticized election, and now the way he instaurated in power, he did a pact with some parts of the opposition, so he controls every state power in Nicaragua, the judicial power, the electoral power, and the parliament. So in the government, they control everything. He also has a huge Venezuelan corporation that works as a private enterprise and that gives money for the government projects. So since he controls all the state institutions, he also controls military and police. So independent journalism in Nicaragua is a really endangered species. There is, the state is not autonomous. The opposition, it's not strong, but the social movements are. So regarding freedom of expression, there are a few independent media. One of them is Confidencial en Esta Semana, where I work. There are others, of course. Lots of local radios as well. And also, one of the main issues is that there is this big television and radio duopoly. 6 channels are controlled by a Mexican businessman called Gonzalez, and the other 6 channels are controlled by Ortega Murillo, the presidential family. And there's just one channel that it's not controlled by them. Regarding the news, of course, in television and radio, they are not covering the things that are happening, and they are not criticizing the government or talking about the social movements, for example, against the canal. That I will talk about that later. But there are a few media that are working on it. And in the daily basis, we are not like Honduras or Mexico, where journalists are unfortunately killed all the time. But we do have certain restrictions. We don't have access to public information. We don't have access to interview a minister or a public functionary. And so in resume, I think there are many shadows and few lights regarding journalism in my country.
Well, Cuba is something aside of this. I mean, it's quite different from the rest of the countries because in Cuba there is no an open freedom of expression. For example, for an independent journalist like me and other colleagues back in the island, it's quite difficult as well, as she says, to have an interview with a functionary from the government because he might lose his job. And basically, the independent journalism in our country has been marginalized by the government for more than 56 years. Even the word opposition, that is the only fact of think different from something, is seen by the Cuban government like something wrong, like a bad word. And basically, most of the Cubans are afraid to talk with independent journalists, because they are afraid to lose their jobs. They are afraid to be called by the political police. Even though to make our work more complicated, we have to make our own studies in our apartments, and we are under surveillance 24 hours. Even to make to go and cover a news that's something that is happened, we have to spend days out of the apartment in order to not be seen by our neighbors. It's quite difficult. What happened in Cuba is that for 56 years, the government have been trying to say to the people that the independent journalism, they are about people, and the only kind of journalism that works in Cuba is the official journalism, that is the voice of the government, because it's completely linked to the government. But now I think things are changing, because in the 80s, from the 70s to the early 80s, the Cuban people were completely isolated from the rest of the world. I mean, they only were used to see things from the old Soviet Union, now Russia. And now, from the 90s till now, there are a lot of people that are migrating to different parts of the world and to the US as well. And they are sharing information, they are watching what is happening in the real world outside the country. And they are bringing those vital information to their families back. So now the Cubans are more open, I mean the people, not the government, are more open to accept the independent journalism. Therefore, my enterprise, the one I direct, is making a great effort in order to recover the trust of the people into the independent journalism, because the people for years have been losing the hopes in the independent journalism for those reasons, because of the government. And basically our work is under a risk. I was listening in other conference in which I participate, and I was amazed about listening stories about war journalists. It's amazing because they were in a conflict in which they saw a lot of victims. But in Cuba, there is something to be a journalist, independent journalist, is very, very complicated because you cannot, I mean, if you become an independent journalist, then you don't have opportunities to work because the political police, in every work you're going to work, talk to the enterprise and says you are on a counter-revolutionary, that you are a mercenary, etc. And so it's a tough decision to be an independent journalist because it's a matter, I mean, then you won't have any way to feed your family because you are not accepted into works by the government. And basically right now, thanks to the internet, we are having so new hopes because in some way the Cubans are starting to see how the world works and how it's the outside, and there is a freedom of expression. In Cuba, to put you an example, to find a citizen that might be spoken to an independent journalist freely is something rare because, as I told you before, not only the functionaries are afraid to lose their job. A normal citizen might be interrogated by the political police after the interview, saying why you were talking to that person, do you know that person is a counter-revolutionary, etc. So to change that concept of the people from the independent journalism, we've been trying to become more professional. That thanks to some ONG that have been helping us. Because there is another thing. In Cuba, to become a journalist, a professional journalist, for us, in my personal case, is quite difficult in order that I cannot go to the university because if I don't have the same ideas of concept of the revolution, so I cannot get inside. And if by any reason I'm able to access to a university and I can become myself into a professional journalist, then when I started work in a magazine or any newspaper, I wouldn't be able to express my own ideas freely because there is a censorship that only publish what it's okay for the government. That's the actual situation about journalism in our country.
Thanks. Now, I think that would be interesting if they tell us about some specific thing they covered that was difficult or interesting. In the case of Nicaragua, for example, there is now a big movement against the building of the Interoceanic Canal. So I would like Danae to tell us about how she and their team covered the marches against the canal.
First of all, I would like to explain what the canal project is. In 2013, the government of Ortega gave a concession to a Chinese businessman called Wang Jing to build an interoceanic canal and several sub-projects. It was a law made without a public consult, without studies for economic and social and environmental feasibility. And as well, it will, many independent experts say that it will put in danger some ecosystems. Well, lots of people will have to go from their land. And as well, it puts in danger the lake Cocibolca, which is the biggest lake in Nicaragua. That is as well one of the biggest water reservoirs in Central America. So the government also hasn't demonstrated that they have the money to build the canal. So the peasants, campesinos, started to protest because they don't want to give up their land, which is as well the most productive land in Nicaragua. Is where I think 40 or 50% of the food that Nicaragua produces is. So they have done 64 protests. 3 of them have been national. I covered one of them last October. So this is the coverage that we made for Confidencial. We are a small team, but we try to, there was different parts. So actually, what happened is that the campesinos, or the peasants, came from rural communities 800 kilometers from Managua. So since there was this big military and police operation to block their path. But they passed because there were so many people that the police had to let them pass. So for journalists in the coverage of this, there are so many dangers and so many problems. First of all, the police doesn't let you go to the places. They always block you. If you say you are a journalist and you want to pass a police block, they won't let you pass. So you have to take different roads. You have to, for example, doing this coverage. No, it's not this. But doing this coverage, I had to walk cross country in a military zone to get to a roadblock. So actually, since police and military are controlled by the government and they see independent journalists as a threat, they don't let you do your job. So in this case, we were a team. I think we were 2 journalists, 2 cameramen, and 1 photographer. We did a television piece. That is this one. I'm not gonna show it. I don't know what happened. But yeah, and as well. But actually, this is the TV program where I work. This is my boss. So basically, I think since this is the main topics, one of the main topics that we cover, it was a good example to show you how we work and what we go against every day. So yes, as I told you before, they don't kill us. They are not in-person journalists, but every day you have to deal with a functionary that doesn't want to talk to you. Every day there is a public information access law that it's not working, and of course the police is always trying to block your way whenever you're trying to do some coverage. I think that's it.
Thanks. And in the case of Cuba, as you probably know, Barack Obama was visiting the island like 15 days ago or something. And I would like to ask Ignacio how it was for an independent journalist covering such an event.
Well, actually, it was something, for me, it was a very good experience to have this covering of a presidential or diplomatic relationship between Washington and Habana. Even that the political police knew that I was invited by the embassy of the United States because it was published in some media. I had to spend 2 or 3 days sleeping outside my apartment in order to go there because my house was completely full with police cars, and I mean to avoid any covering of the news. But thanks because I was sleeping in another place, that didn't happen, so I could go and cover the news. But before that meeting, there was there was a first meeting in which I was invited formally by the embassy, and when I was making my willing to go, I was detained by the political police and took to a police station for more than 4 hours, and there they were interrogating me, because now there is a new politic in the police, that is that they do not put us on jail, and they just want to take you out of the situation in order that you cannot cover any news. And I was accused of counter-revolutionary just for go and covering a simple news. It was a news about the visit of President Barack Obama in Cuba, and this opening and this new relationship. It's something amazing, because when I talked to the political police in the time I was detained, they accused me of being a counter-revolutionary, and I said, I'm not a counter-revolutionary, I'm not an oppositor, I'm not Democrat or Republican or whatever you want to call it. I'm just a journalist, and something is happening there, and I want to cover the news, why I am here. And they don't understand that. That's something very, that's something that I think it shouldn't happen anymore in my country. And that's basically what is happening in Cuba. We do not have freedom of expression. And if you see in some channels a Cuban talking to unofficial cameras, they always gonna say positive things, because otherwise they are gonna be in some way interviewed by the political police later, a week later or whatever. So to cover Obama's visit was something, like I said before, very risky, because I have the risk of losing my equipment. In these days, a few years back, they used to take our cameras off. Now they are using another politic. They erase our material, and then they give the camera back, but they do not fill any document that says that I was on prison for a period of time, maybe 4 or 5 hours detained, because they don't want to give us any documentation in that way. So I wasn't in prison during that time. And that's what is happening now in our country. There is another news that I cover, that in that one I'm proud of, is that something that this year there was a lack of food in our country, and we did the first investigative work from the independent press. I mean, video reporting, because there are a lot of journalists that used to write articles on web pages. And I said I'm proud of this work, because it was the first time that we demonstrate to the government that we are able to become ourselves more professional without going to the Cuban universities and study and have been studying for a journalist in their universities. This work, to make this work, we have to sell some of our personal things, because as you all know, to make news, you need some funds. I mean, to travel, to take a car and whatever. And the situation in Cuba is completely different from the rest of the world. Just to put you an example, a Cuban wage is 250 pesos. That means that you may work for $12 or $15 per month. Imagine that. So imagine to make press with $15 a month. That's something completely amazing. So we have to make that report. We sell some of our things to travel to some provinces, and how could I say this? We make some plans in order to interview some functionaries from the government, and we did it. And it was a great opportunity to demonstrate that the Cuban people, that the independent journalists were able to do such a work. And the work when we finish the work, that we publish the work on our web site. Well, actually, not my website, on YouTube, in my channel called En Caliente, Prensa Libre. The impact was so great that the government, a few weeks later, did a work almost like our work, even using some of our speeches. And that's an interesting point, because we, in some way, are starting to force the government to do things, because otherwise they will perish, because the space of censorship that they have is starting to be taken by the independent press. So I think we're doing a great job in that case, and also the people are starting to lose and starting not to be afraid, and the people are starting to recover the trust in the independent journalists, because they are seeing that we are not the ones that the government says we are, and we are not only interested in politics, because for the government, everything that the independent journalists are doing is concerning things against the government. No, the independent journalists in Cuba right now are covering cultural things and politics and sport or whatever, and that's something that the Cuban people need to start seeing, and I think we are reaching that point. The Cuban people are really tired of seeking the light at the end of the tunnel, and finally, with the new technologies like the internet, they are having some alternative ways to compare and watch vital information, and I think we're going in a straight line to reach our goals.
So now I would like Danae to explain us which other actors, other than the government, make her job difficult, because in Cuba and Nicaragua the situation is quite different. In Cuba there is the government putting some problems to independent journalism, but in Nicaragua there is the government, but there is also other issues doing the journalism.
Okay. Well, to do this, as you know, making journalism costs money, and independent journalism now in Nicaragua are struggling, because if the government, of course, doesn't give you state publicity because you are against them or they see you like that, but there as well the private enterprise. In Nicaragua, even though Ortega's government is it's in the ALVA government, and it's recognized as a left because they come from the Sandinista revolution, they have a huge alliance with the private sector. They negotiate the laws together, they negotiate the minimum wage without a third part from the workers. So this said, they are pretty much friends. So since you know, what is happening in Nicaragua now regarding the private enterprises is that whenever independent media, independent newspaper, independent TV show goes and cover an issue that you know, affects them. For example, in Nicaragua there is a hugely recognized public health issue. It's chronic kidney disease, that it's related to the biggest company in Nicaragua, that it's called Grupo Pelas, that does the Flor de Caña rum. Many of you may know them. So, so whenever independent media cover these kinds of issue, or regarding, for example, big bank issues, what they do is they cut you the publicity. If you have a contract for publicity with them and you cover something that they don't like, they cut the publicity. So they are basically choking the independent media through money. I think that's the main issue, and since there are no controls and there is, you know, no one that you can rely on. So that's what is happening in Nicaragua. So many, for example, many of local radios are struggling for this because they depend on a small income regarding the publicity, but they cannot, criticize or say something against the government or the private enterprises as well. So many, I think one of the biggest challenges for independent journalism in Nicaragua is to be able to don't censor yourself because of that. To try to investigate. We do have lots of stories to tell. We don't get bored. So actually, what happens is that you have to decide which one you have to take and which challenges you will go through it. So yeah, basically that. We are as well, but it's not like in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. We are the safest country in Central America, but we do also go face to face with some criminal organizations and stuff that work in Central America as well. Of course, as I said, not as Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, but they are also a threat in Central America.
I think a good example of this is the case of the chronic renal disease. I don't think if I say it properly. I would like you to explain us a little bit why there are not enough covering of this issue and what happened about this.
Okay, so Confidencial is actually one of the few media that actually covered the chronic kidney disease is a mortal disease that it's apparently it hasn't been deeply investigated, but what they say is that the conditions of work of the people that work with sugar plants, sun dehydration, and chemics that they use for the plants are causing that. So almost all of the workers of this company that produces the rum are dying. And the government doesn't want to do a public discussion about this topic, doesn't want to put money in the hospital of that town where they produce the rum. So the company also doesn't want to talk about it, and there is not a public recognition of the issue in the country. So whenever independent media talks about this issue, they are as well cutting the publicity, as I said before. And as well, I think one of the people from one organization that worked with this, with the people that are sick with chronic kidney disease, was banned from the country. He couldn't enter the airport, and he was sent back because of that. So basically, since they are friends, they protect each other. And one of the main issues is that this alliance that they have, makes difficult for journalists to work because the government protects everything that the private enterprises does, and at the same time, the private enterprises protects the government. There is another example. There is this big mine company called B2 Gold. It's Canadian, I think, and there was this big protest of miners, and the government sent the police to repress the protests from the miners and to protect the company. So basically, that's how it works.
So now I would like you to tell us about how do you see the future of the journalism in your countries? Because, for example, in Cuba, due to the more connection to internet now and to the new situation, do you know that Cuba is having a lot of changes in these days? There are the independent journalism is growing, and also the, let's say, the pseudo-official journalism is maybe starting to be more critical with government covering things they don't used to cover. But in Nicaragua, I feel the opposite. I feel that the independent journalism touch like a ceiling or something, and is in risk. I don't know, what do you think about that? I would like you to explain a little bit.
Okay, Nicaragua has a big tradition for independent and investigative journalism. It's not something new. I think I cannot say what will happen in the future, but I still have hope. I mean, even though there's not much people doing independent journalism in Nicaragua, I think it would always exist, and there will be always people willing to do it. I think it depends on several factors. This year we're supposed to have elections. The government hasn't called elections yet, but it depends on that, and it depends on the future of the Venezuelan cooperation. I actually think that Nicaragua, it's a country full of stories, and you never get bored. You are always with new stories to tell. So if there are stories, I think there will always be journalism. So.
Well, how do I see the future of independent journalism in Cuba? I think it's growing and it cannot stop. One of the reasons is, like I said before, in the 80s, Cuba was completely blind and isolated from the rest of the world, just receiving everything from the old Soviet Union field. But after it collapsed, Cuba, the government had to take new strategies, and one of those strategies was the implementation of the tourism in the island. And because of the tourism, it was inevitable to, the people were established communication with the tourists and that stuff. With tourism, it was coming together technology. And to tell you the truth, maybe for you to have a digital camera, small digital camera, is something common in our country. It's not now. It's going to be common, but a few years back it was almost impossible. But with the development and the introducing of the internet in our country, I feel sure and I see the journalism, independent journalism in our country, is gonna be okay. Why? Because the Cubans are starting to see and believe in the independent journalists, because now it's easy to open a channel on YouTube and publish your videos and reports, because otherwise, before the introduction of the internet in our country, we didn't have chances to publish our work, because we are not authorized by the government. It's illegal to broadcast, to open an independent or a private enterprise of journalism. But with this marvelous tool of the internet, though it's expensive, because I want you to know that in Cuba, like I told you before, you may have a wage of $15, maximum $20 per month after a whole month of work. And the internet is, you have to buy a card for 50 Cuban pesos. So if you have 50 Cuban pesos to use on the internet, you have two choices. One, to use the internet to communicate with your families outside the country, or to look for informative pages. So mostly of the Cubans they take the first option to communicate with their families. But thanks to this new relationship between the United States, between Washington and Habana, and the whole world is pushing hard in order that the Cuban might have lower prices for the internet. And with this internet, the journalists are going to be able to share and to grab information. So the world is changing, and our country needs to change, and otherwise it will perish. Cuba was stopped in time for more than 56 years. It's unbelievable. If one of you may travel to Cuba, you will realize what I'm telling you. The Cuba looks like an old rolling museum. Mostly of the cars are from the 50s, from the 40s. To buy a car, it costs, for example, 5 times what it costs in any developed country. It's better not to talk about it. That's why I'm saying that independent journalists will have a better future with the development of the internet. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to make our own reports and to have our own channels and to help people solve their problems through our reports.
Okay, so if you have any question to Danae or Ignacio?
Yeah, of course. Facebook, Twitter, and those social media is what you mean, no? You have right to open? Yes, and now, well, even though we have internet now in Cuba, internet is not on all the places. There are selected places in the city or in the provinces in which you have Wi-Fi spot under the sun, under the rain, so you're not comfortable to have those social medias. But Facebook, Twitter, and that stuff, you're allowed. But there still exists some censorship in some web pages, like pages that talks against the Cuban government. For example, martinoticias.com is prohibited. It's censorship. You cannot get into that web page. But at the same time, you might see, you are able to see Martin Noticias on YouTube. I don't know why, but and so the web page, you are not allowed to see the web page, but otherwise you are allowed to see Martin Noticias and all the stuff on YouTube. And that's good because the Cubans are starting to share ideas. They are starting to. Concerning Facebook, I was amazed because when it started, the first Wi-Fi spot, maybe a couple of months, 5 months ago, or something like, I saw people amazing, trying, with difficulties when they were trying to connect, because they're not used. It's very primitive. People don't have that knowledge. And in a few months, everybody knows everything about Facebook and YouTube and Twitter, even more than me, that I have been spending time with internet. So it's crazy how the youth, the young people from 18 years, 12 years, even 7 years, old people are working with the internet. So in some way, it's working. I think internet is a marvelous tool that can be, that give you the chances that the government doesn't give you. And it's working, yes.
And in Nicaragua, that helped social media, or?
Yes, I think social media has been hugely part of some small movements in Nicaragua, even though our connectivity is like really small, like 10%, 12%, because in Nicaragua is the second poorest country in Latin America. So people haven't actually, lots of people have a telephone, but they don't have a smartphone. They just use it to communicate. So connectivity is not that good in the rural side. In the capital, Managua, it is, and it's. I think social media has been a huge part. Maybe not in the campesinos canal movement, for example, but in other movements. In 2013, there was a big protest supporting an elderly an elderly petition to the government to give their pension, and the elderly said that they will die in protest. So there were a bunch of young people and students that used social media to gather together with the elderly, and the protest was called Ocupains, and actually was a protest for like a week. And on the fifth day, the government sent the police and their paramilitaries to repress the protest, and they robbed. They beat like 50 people. They beat elderly people, and 3 days later, the government gave the pension to the elderly people, saying that they were actually the ones that were protecting them and supporting them. So yeah, social media has been a helpful tool, but I think in these countries, it's not the biggest force. It's a helpful tool, but it's not the biggest force.
Yeah, I agree. I think we need to be clear about that in Cuba and Nicaragua, internet is still something for very few people. So, for example, I found very, very interesting about Nicaragua that in the marches against the canal, the campesinos arrived to manage to gather themselves and to protest without the social media, only talking with the community leaders and with other kind of communication. So I think, yeah, it is important, but still these countries need other ways to communicate and to get together. So any other question, please?
I want to ask a question to both of you. Do you think that journalists from abroad will face the same difficulties if they want to cover problems in your countries, or do they come across other problems?
You mean for Cuba?
Both countries.
Well, in Cuba, if you are a journalist from outside and you want to cover news, you have to go and check with the government. And you will be in problems. For example, if you want to cover news concerning in Spanish, Damas de Blanco, in English, the ladies in white, they have every Sunday they have a meeting. And you may go to cover the news, but you are going to be investigated and you're going to be followed by the Secret Service. So next time you come to Cuba, you probably wouldn't be in Cuba anymore. So, I mean, they let you the first time, but they're going to be following all what you're doing. That's something that I think with these new technologies and this new era between United States and Cuba, and those, because now a lot of eyes are pointing to Cuba, and Cuba needs to be openly free to the rest of the world. I think we are not authorized to make journalism, independent journalism, but we are starting. I mean, the government is starting to tolerate us because we're becoming more professional, and if you become more professional, they won't have so many reasons to stop you. In your case, you're a professional, you can go to our country, but like I said before, next time, I think you're going to be in problems. That's it.
Actually, no. In Nicaragua, it's really hard. If you present yourself as a journalist, actually, there have been 2 or 3 journalists and writers that have been kicked out of the country for writing about, especially about the canal. There was, I think the name was Michelle Senazael. She was a Belgian photographer that was kicked out of the country, and actually she reported that the military took her from a protest and kicked her out. So, but there are ways, of course. We are there is less surveillance by the government. So probably you will have to be really clever and maybe come in as a tourist. But if you present yourself in the doors of the airport as a journalist, they won't let you in, and they will take your cameras. But I think there has been some journalists that have entered the country through, for example, Costa Rica or Honduras, that haven't had that restriction. But I think it depends on the moment that you pick of going. And but if you do, everything legal, you say you're a journalist, they will, send you to an office from the state. Probably they won't let you pass what they think you should know about the country. So especially happens, for example, I think it was 2 months ago, there was this Mexican journalist that actually was half Nicaraguan, so it was a crazy thing. And she was writing about culture, about Rubén Darío, the poet. And whenever she said that she was a journalist in the airport and she had cameras and stuff, the government retained it for like, I think it was 36 hours, until she had to negotiate with them, and she lose lots of interviews that she had scheduled. So it's kind of dangerous, and it's becoming more dangerous and more tricky to enter Nicaragua as a journalist to do especially political and social pieces.
Some other question?
Hello. I'm sorry I came in late, so if you already said it, I'm very sorry. Who's your audience? You said that in Nicaragua connectivity is very low. In Cuba, internet access is very difficult. You are digital media. So who's your audience? Do you preach to the believers, or do you reach also other people?
Okay. In the case of Cuba, we have been developing other ways to spread our news. For example, on memory flash, on CDs, because people don't have too much access to the internet. For example, they come to my house. That is at the same time I study, and they are all the time hunger for information. And so I start to spread the news. So my audience is the Cuban people. Well, not the 11 million Cuban people, of course. But as you know, in Miami, for example, there is almost 2 million Cubans living there. And I give mostly one of my reports to Martín Noticias, and Martín Noticias publish it on the internet, and on the other side I spread the news through memories from one cell phone to another cell phone, and that's the way we have to spread the news. And basically, well, actually you were not here, but in the beginning I said journalism was very obstacled by the government, but now with the entrance of the new technologies, people have more cell phone and people have more cameras, and they have some other ways. So my audience, to giving you an answer, is the Cuban people, mostly from Cuba and from the United States, because we have more than 2 million, almost 2 million Cubans in the United States. That's it.
Well, for the media that I work, we produce 4 things. We produce Confidencial, which is a digital website. We also have a seminal publication, a printed publication. We have 2 TV shows, one daily, Esta Noche, and one weekly, Esta Semana, that goes on TV, on the only independent channel in the TV. So our audience, it's different. The people that see the television show, for example, it's almost everyone that wants. It's the only investigative journalism TV show in Nicaragua. So almost everyone that is interested in seeing big investigative pieces, we do like 12 to 15 pieces. They're big, and in Confidencial, we actually have lots of people. We try not to, you know, do what you said, to pray for the convinced. We actually try to cover several topics, and it's one, I think Confidencial it's recognized by the people that it's not like other, you know, independent media that are seen just as opposition, but as an independent media that some people from the government read as well. Some ministers, for example, do receive the printed publication of Confidencial. So I think it depends on which channel you see it, but we try not to be, you know, just to write or to tell some things that are only for the people that are against government, but as well we try to cover things that the government are doing, maybe not the best way, but they are doing some things, like, you know, they have rebuilt parks in Managua, and that's a good thing. So, yeah.
More questions?
Sorry, no time.
No time. Okay, so thank you, everyone.